I should preface my talk by saying that it has its origins in the work I did with Raffaele Cribiore, who passed away unexpectedly summer 2023. After we decided to propose our entretien with What is Your Heart on ancient classrooms rather than on ancient books and text formats, which was our original idea. She was working on note taking at the time. She began to joke that she would eventually turn me from a scholar of ancient Greek poetry into a scholar of ancient education like herself. So perhaps these remarks represent something like the first steps in that transformation. This talk attempts to account for what Raffaele called the relentless gymnastics of the alphabet, and that's what those quotation marks are doing on part one of my, on the subtitle of part one of my talk. This expression refers to the remarkable range of activities and exercises that were used to teach ancient Greek primary school children the alphabet. A strikingly literal representation of the phrase gymnastics of the alphabet is found in our fragments from the late 5th century BCE comic play entitled either Alphabet Tragedy or Letter Parade. Both titles are given by the citing authority Athenaeus, which is said to have been written by the comic playwright Callias. In this play, the 24-person comic chorus was made to represent the 24 letters of the Ionian alphabet. So all our evidence for this play, for the existence of this play, and all of our information about it derives from this one source, Athenaeus, who cites 4 fragments and gives some contextual evidence, not very clear contextual evidence, it must be said. The first of these fragments is a metrical list of the names of the letters of the alphabet in sequence. And that is this first passage on the slide, on the slideshow. The Athenian Callias composed the so-called alphabet tragedy, arranging it in the following manner. Its prologue is made up of letters, and then we can skip the rest for the moment. And he says, well, the fragment reads, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, the divine A, Zeta, Eta, Theta, Iota, Kappa, Lambda, Mu, Nu, Xi, the letter U, or the U, potentially, Pe, Rho, the sigma, Tau, the U, and beside it, Phi, K, and the letter Psi, right down to O or Omega. What is going on here? As I previously suggested, this passage appears to be a description of the chorus by one of the characters in the scene as it enters onto the theater stage. We have a parallel for this type of individual identification of the members of a chorus as they enter onto a stage in the quick-fire naming of the final 18 bird species in Aristophanes' play, The Birds. They make up the chorus of that play, these different birds. In that play, the naming of the birds during the entry of the chorus takes place as part of a larger birding scene where the characters are identifying the different species of birds. And the first 6 of these birds, so 18 different bird types are given here. The first sort of 6 are given in a longer passage where they are looking out for different birds and spotting them. In Callias, by contrast, the narrative frame that justifies this entry of the letter names appears from the other fragments of this play, together with this passage, to be that of students learning their letters in a schoolroom. We hear about learning the letters in sequence in this way from a much later authority, namely Quintilian. In his discussion of primary education, Quintilian criticizes learning the sound of the letters before looking at their shape. I do not like the procedure, he says, which is very common, by which children learn the names and the sequence of the letters before their shapes. And a little further on, this is why teachers, even when they think they have sufficiently fixed the letters in a child's mind, and note these words in the order in which they are commonly first written, next reverse this and muddle it up in various ways until the pupils come to recognize the letters by their shape and not the order in which they come. It will be best, therefore, for them to be taught the appearance and the name side by side. And note again these words, it is like recognizing people. So as Quintilian indicates, the Greeks and Romans practiced their letters, not unlike us, in a specific order from alpha to omega. Unlike us, they also learned it in other sequences, so in reverse order and in various other orderings, or as Quintilian puts it, muddled up in various ways, right? Permutazione turbent. Even the most basic learner was asked to write the letters in reverse order, as we can see here on an ostracon in Sydney, on which the school child, Kemetis, who writes his name on the first line, then writes the first four letters, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and then attempts to write them backwards, beta, gamma, alpha. So, but he misses it and writes the gamma with omega tau. We know of various schema, also much more advanced ones, not just forwards and backwards. For example, we know of recitation of the letters in a sequence which skips, which jumps 4 letters, skips 3 letters. So it jumps from one. So here we have alpha. It's quite hard to read this, but alpha, and looking down the first column, epsilon, which we can just stand up and point to it so you can see it here, followed by iota and mu, and then we start again at beta, and so on through the alphabet. Such procedures could reach dizzying levels of complexity. We have one school exercise written on an ostracon, for example, which shows the alphabet written out in the following order. The first letter alpha followed by the last, omega, then the second, beta, followed by the second last, C, and so on. And it has been pointed out that heliograpers have pointed out that the student appears from the ink traces to have gone all the way down to mu and then gone back up from nu, so that's Mustratodon. But presumably the exercise set by the teacher was to write it out in this sequence, which it looks like it was written out as at first. These were so there are different degrees of complexity, but these are all elementary school exercises. They were required of all school pupils, and the extent of their use, their widespread use, is subtly reflected in a Hellenistic epigram by Aratus, which bemoans the life of a school teacher named Diotimus. This is preserved in the Greek anthology. I mourn Diotimus, who sits reading beta and alpha with the children among the rocks at Gargara. The epigram bemoans Diotimus's position in the world, right? His life as an elementary school teacher. It's not the only example of those poor ancient teachers, okay, not, their lives being looked down upon or being bemoaned here. And this epigram invokes the language of funerary epigram, or maybe that of tragedy, a tragedy with this initial ayazdo, I mourn. Okay, but he's not dead. This isn't a funerary epigram. Diotimus is living. What I want to point out today, though, is the order in which the letters are given. Diotimus teaches first beta, then alpha, and there's no metrical requirement for this order. We can readily imagine the letter names reversed, right? Gargareon, Pisine, alpha, chi beta, legon. It works just as well. Alpha is long by position, so they could be swapped. Even more odd from a contemporary perspective are the tongue twisters used in schools called kalinoi in Greek, to which Quintilian also refers. And I will read this as well. It would be a good idea at this age, in order to develop the vocal organs and make the speech more distinct, to get the child to rattle off as fast as he can words and verses designed to be difficult, formed of strings of syllables which clash with one another, and which are rocky, as it were. The Greeks call them kalinoi, tongue twisters. And this is meant to stop bad pronunciation. The words most commonly encountered in the schoolroom papyri, and we mean papyri here generally to refer to any schoolroom exercise, also ostraca, are various forms of gibberish. Next, speak, for example, thupes, phlegmo, drops is a common sequence, which is made up of all 24 letters of the alphabet, sometimes called pangrams. And we can see part of one here, the beginning of that sequence, knax. And in the first line, of course, is the alphabet just in its normal sequence. There are various combinations known of these letters, various pangrams with all the letters of the alphabet made up into nonsense words. Clement of Alexandria identifies a series of 4 such tricky words as writing copy for children, hypogramos paitikos. And it's notable, well, I'll show you another one before moving on. This is the inverse side of the tablet we've already looked at from the Louvre, which, again, reading down, has Max in the first column, and then Z. Yeah, and it has these tongue twisters that I've already mentioned. Okay, through Tess is you can see it kind of goes over those next 2 columns, and Fle, well, I guess that is drops in the last column. Okay. But what I want to point to next is that these tongue twisters appear to have been very early, and they are found in a fragment of Pseudothespis, a reference to them, which treats them as though they are meaningful. Although I've left, by putting them in apposition to other words. For example, this connects speed with, loicon and so on. I don't really want to get into this, but the presence of these words, okay, in this early poem which is generally thought to go back to the 4th century BC. There's a story about Heraclides of Pontus having, written these plays ascribed to Thespis. And since he was in the 4th century, we think this text probably goes back to that period. In any case, it's quite a bit earlier than the material evidence that we have for these tongue twisters, and suggests that they go back quite early. Not only that, it suggests that they were widely enough known that they could be alluded to, as in a passage like this. Mixing up the letters into various combinations is precisely what Callias's alphabet chorus did through their performance. Looking back to our first text, when Athenaeus introduces the quotation, the victory that I left out, he says that one must also bring the end from ten teleoetein, bring the end back to the alpha, right? Katastropikos hoi umenus eis talpha. And no one has been quite sure what this means. I suspect that he is referring here to a recitation of the alphabet, not only forwards, but also that one had to read this also backwards in the Katastropikos, maybe in the next strophe in the antistrophe, okay? More importantly, Athenaeus cites in the next fragment from this lost play a second, in this case unmetrical, he gives a second unmetrical quotation in which he identifies the nature of the first song that was sung by this chorus. And he indicates that this initial song, or parados, was made up of syllable pairs. So beta, alpha, ba, beta, e, be, and so on through the alphabet. Again, this if we compare this to other parodoi from ancient comedy, it is much more nonsensical, but it would have also been immediately familiar to many in the audience because it is a schoolroom exercise. This is another reason to think that the imagined setting for Callias's play was the schoolroom. So the paradox is also useful because it helps us imagine what Callias's chorus might have looked like, an issue that I've sort of skirted around in mentioning this play so far. In the first fragment that we've looked at, each chorus member represents one individually identifiable letter of the alphabet. So it might seem plausible that the chorus wore a costume emblazoned with one of the letters, which made them each individually represent a letter shape. But when the chorus altogether sings and performs the syllable pairs during their first dance routine, in the parados, one also wonders if they somehow mimed the letter shapes with their bodies. And I'm thinking here of something like Mo Farah's M-bot, which he does at the end of a race, right? The M, which signals his name, or the dance routine, the well-known dance routine of the YMCA. And when I was looking for a suitable image, this one struck me just because it's so odd. Point of cultural contact, somehow attempting to bridge a contact between this soldier, this American soldier, and I believe this is in Afghanistan, through the shared use of the YMCA dance. I don't know, there's something very uncanny about this image, I thought, and this is why I put it down. There are many other examples of these dance moves being performed often in stadium in the States. But more importantly, we have an ancient parallel for this kind of dancing of letter shapes. And this is also found in Linnaeus, who says that a character in Sophocles' satyr play, the Amphiaros, danced the letters. Right, ta, grammata, or kumenon. And since the reference here is to a single person dancing multiple letters, these cannot easily have been represented by costume, nor would this match, I think, the force of the participle, which indicates that the letters were formed through the dancing. So Callias' play provides a nice example of how the letters were imagined to work. They danced around and were recombined in various ways. Right? It is a play which represents this recombination of the letters in a schoolroom. His is a literalized version of alphabet exercises performed by elementary school pupils throughout antiquity. And this brings me to the question that's really guiding this paper, this talk. What was the purpose of these letter exercises? Even if we can say that Callias' play may be a parody of such exercises at an early stage of their development, they seem to have been widely used and they became a mainstay of the Greek educational tradition from some point in the 5th century at the latest, well into late antiquity. So some justifications are given by ancient authors. We've already seen how Quintilian indicates that the inversions of the alphabet are to help the student recognize the letter shapes, whereas the kalinoi, or tongue twisters, are to practice enunciation, so a sort of early oratorical exercise. All of our evidence, however, indicates that all of the different types of alphabet exercise took place within the same type of schoolroom environment. It wasn't that one was part of an oratorical training and another was part of elementary curricula. They were all part of the same curriculum. Alphabets appear on school exercises in the regular and inverse order. Some exercises have alphabets as well as syllable combinations. And on this document, we have a remarkable papyrus which has all the possible combinations on one document. There is an alphabet in standard order on the first line, then one in inverse order, various syllable pairs you can see at the bottom, and even a tongue twister or kalinos. So Quintilian gives us plausible interpretations, even justifications of why these exercises were used, but I would like to suggest that the Greek alphabet also served a broader set of purposes than the alphabet does for us today, or even than it did in Quintilian's own day. The practices done by the alphabetic practices done by elementary pupils in ancient Greece were not a distinct part of the curriculum, but an attempt to provide facility in a tool that served a much broader range of organizational functions than the alphabet did for Quintilian. And this brings me to my second part of my talk, cultural functions. And I mean, I hesitated between cultural functions and alphabet functions. Really what I'm thinking here by the word function is something akin to how the word is used in mathematics. When one applies a term, here, when one applies the alphabet, how does it transform what we are talking about? So one standard explanation that scholars have given for all of the different letter exercises beyond those we've just discussed in Quintilian is the use of the alphabet also for counting, not just for reading and writing. And it was the Ionic alphabet that was most prominent as a number system, replacing a different and older method of using abbreviations of the number names to indicate given numbers. So in an earlier system, P would represent pente, for example, meaning 5. In the Ionic system, the first 9 letters map on to the first 9 numbers. So alpha is 1, beta is 2, and so on. And then from 10 on, from iota, we have multiples of 10, so it's a decimal system. Iota is 10, lambda is 20, and so on. If we add in a few disused letters like digamma, and you can count up into the thousands. And I've included here a table of calculations from a funerary stele of a teacher of geometry named Ptolemy, Geneva, this story in Geneva, from the 3rd century BCE. And it uses this ionic numbering system. What's missing from the stele as we currently have it, but Chamet has suggested, I think, probably accurately, that there's a stick missing, which points at one of the numbers on the table, so that the figure's arm motion is, in fact, a way of signaling that he's in the middle of teaching, even though the character on the bottom right is probably not a student, but a slave, as in many of these funerary stele. Just that's a typical feature of that composition, that type of composition. And the lyre in the background is another reflection of his teacherly function overall. He might have also taught music. The fact that this system, this numbering system, uses the Ionic alphabet, and that this Ionic alphabet and numeral system displaced an earlier way of counting is remarkable. The introduction of the Ionic alphabet occurred over a long period of time, and it's well known that Euclides formalized its use in Athens in 403 BCE, although presumably Attic lettering was already being displaced in less formal contexts before that date. We can't closely match the introduction of the Ionic alphabet to the increasing reach of primary education, for which our earliest evidence is the school building collapsing on the kiosk, which Herodotus mentions in 496. However, training in the Ionic alphabet in schools, such as we see referred to by Callias, will inevitably have reinforced and extended the familiarity with the Ionic alphabet, which is used in this new numbering system. In this system, numbers are distinguished from letters by a supernumerary dash. And it's important to note that we do find these kind of dashes on school texts, and this is one example of that on the zeta, which I in the middle of the first line. So this suggests that these alphabetic gymnastic exercises were sometimes, at least, tied up with ideas about mathematical manipulation of numbers. The use of the alphabet wasn't just limited to mathematics, though. It was also found, for example, in musical notation in this famous early musical papyrus, which shows lines from the Orestes with musical notation. Two forms of notation are known, one for instruments, the other for voice, a distinction which may have its origin in the need to distinguish vocal from instrumental parts on scores. And the vocal way of recording appears to be the slightly newer one, and it again involves the use of the Ionic alphabet. In other words, the musical notation or the development of musical notation seems to have followed a similar pattern to that we see in the development of the symbols for calculation, an increasing use of the Ionic alphabet. It's really just a guess or postulating something rather than stating anything here. But is this again a shared context? We know that musical training formed part of the ancient school curriculum. Was it also the case that increasing familiarity with Ionic led to the use of that letter system for some parts, the vocal parts, the ones that would have been most common perhaps in ancient schoolrooms? There are other uses of the alphabet that can be found in the daily lives of the Greeks. At Athens, tribes were indicated by letters, and when it came time to select jurors for the courts, these were allotted by acorns inscribed with the letters of the alphabet, beginning at the number 11, so as not to be confused with the first 10 letters, which would indicate the tribe. So one sees here the complexity that comes up in the use of the alphabet for indicating various things. So this need to start at 11, and why maybe facility in manipulating the alphabet in a way that had nothing to do with reading or writing might be useful. There are other examples actually of inscribed foodstuffs, also used in similar ways. Lucian describes how randomized lots were drawn for pairs in wrestling matches to determine who would fight each other at Pancratium. And these are also inscribed with letters. And in a more physically violent version of ordering people, we know that slaves were branded with, among other things, letters on the forehead from at least the 5th century before Common Era. We also know that the physical environment could be understood not just topologically, but typographically. Xenophon describes the flanking structure of a group of in a military maneuver as the letter gamma, for example. And as Philo tells us, the city of Alexandria had 5 districts identified by the first 5 letters of the written alphabet. That's a citation, as he puts it. Pseudo-Callisthenes, in a very similar report on these 5 letters being used for the different districts in Alexandria, gives us a version of this story where each of those 5 letters is is an abbreviation for Alexander, king of the race of Zeus, has founded the city, which will forever be remembered. And we can note here in this pseudo-Callisthenes how delineate or demarcate choreographizas is sort of more emphatically connected with the verb write by being placed beside that verb, beside grapho. Right? It's choreographizas, agraphse. At a more abstract level, this is perhaps my favorite example of them all. Democritus, or at a minimum the citing authority Aristotle in metaphysics, compares the shape, arrangement, and position of elements to the differences in shape, arrangement, and position of the letters alpha and nu. The fact that alpha and nu have different shapes is one model for how elements might differ, but so are their potential combinations as alpha nu, nu alpha. So this is for him a difference of arrangement, which is symbolic of how elements might relate to each other, as is the transformation of a letter shape from nu into zeta, so turning on its side. This facility with permutating the alphabet is, I suggest, based on a deep understanding of elementary schoolroom practices or a familiarity with such practices. It was natural to think in terms of the alphabet beyond its use to represent speech, because one had been trained in its manipulation in ways that had little or nothing to do with writing or speech from an early age. And I'll end with one final example where, once again, the Ionic alphabet specifically, actually, I should have moved to the next slide because this is not tied to this, but where the Ionic alphabet specifically comes to the fore, and so may be connected to its use or to the use of Ionic in schoolrooms. And I'm thinking here of the division of the books of Homer. Already in antiquity, the allocation of letters to the books, so letters of the alphabet to the books of Homer, was thought to go back to Aristarchus. For example, that's said in the Homeric Lives, but there's some disagreement already in antiquity about this. And in any case, Aristarchus and Aristophanes, these 2 Hellenistic scholars, can't have been the ones to ascribe these the letter names to the books, because they wanted to athetize much of Book 23 and all of Book 24 of the Odyssey. Scholarship is divided whether this alphabetic numeration is Alexandrian at all, or whether it's pre-Alexandrian. And importantly, one should note that the use of the 24 letters of the alphabet to identify the different books of Homer is not a normal use of the letters to count in Greek. It is a mapping of the 24 letters onto 24 different books. We see other more natural ways of using the letters to count. Any papyri, the way they divide up books by numbers, those will just use the normal Ionic numeration system, the one with 1 to 9 and then 10 and following for increments of 10. So one way to understand why the alphabet, the 24-letter alphabet, is used to divide up the books of Homer is that this reflects the all-encompassing nature of Homeric epic, right? That Homeric epics contain everything, alpha to omega, so to speak. And this might also explain why that same division of a work into 24 books is also used for Aristotle's metaphysics. But as far as I know, for no other text, except for the 2 of Homer the two great epics on the metaphysics. Okay, so nobody quite knows where this comes from, and I want to put forward one possibility that has not been previously suggested, namely that this comes again from the world of the schoolroom. And I'm thinking here of the classroom of a sophist or an orator who might have a complete Homer. Euthydemus, for example, according to Xenophon in the Memorabilia, has such a set of Homer. And Plutarch, as in the scene here that I've put on the slide, recalls Alcibiades accosting a school teacher who has edited their own copy of Homer, and so whom Alcibiades thinks really shouldn't be teaching school children, but should be training future orators, future young men. Okay, the alphabet and facility with letter permutations were not merely a tool for reading and writing, but a shared group of organizational systems for Greek life, which understood various different types of activity as divisible structures whose parts could be reordered into new combinations. Okay. Perhaps even more surprising from a historical perspective is the contrast between the great number of uses of the alphabet and the existence for the Greeks of correct spelling. And I will end on this point. Xenophon, once again in the Memorabilia, describes a meeting between Socrates and Hippias, in which Hippias, who claims to always say something new, even he is forced to admit that he would say the same words. So he would use the same letters, rather, to spell the name Socrates. He would use the same letters as anyone else and in the same order. And if anyone could have imagined a new permutation or a new use, a new way to reorder the letters, in this instance, it would have been Hippias. So despite all of these various recombinations of letters, it is remarkable compared, say, to the early modern period that spelling was so fixed in antiquity. We still use the Greek alphabet in all sorts of exceptional ways. And in STEM subjects, right, we use the Greek letters to denote special concepts like pi or zeta functions, gamma rays. Theta stands for angle and delta for a difference. And I propose that the Greeks also found special uses and benefits in treating the alphabet as a system of signs that went beyond the representation of speech. Thank you very much.